Welcome back. So we're in Module 8, and this is the second video lecture for Module 8. And we'll pick up where we left off. We've been talking about what a function was, if it needed something from us, did it return something to us, those concepts. Okay. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about arguments and parameters. And the words are used interchangeably. Found on the internet, they say the terms parameter and argument can be used for the exact same thing. Information that is or are passed into a function. So if we defined a function echo and passed it anything, anything would be the argument. But when I mouse over it, it says, hey, that's a parameter. It's about the same thing. Okay. The function looks at it a little bit different. So the function says a parameter is the variable listed inside the parentheses in the function definition. And the argument is what's sent. Now, let's look at it this way. Remember, I talked about this as I'm outsourcing. And let's say that I want to outsource to my buddy Jose. And Jose owns a paint and body shop. And what Jose does in his paint and body shop is his own business. How he goes about things in there, that's him. I don't need to go in there. I don't need to know how he does what he needs to do. All I need to know is, what does he require from me and in what form? And is he going to do something for me or return me something? Or maybe both. He could do something and return something. So let's say he requires something from me. He needs a car. He needs the car that he's going to paint for me. So I'm going to have to pass him my car. And I'm going to have to pass him the paint. And I got to pass him some money. So there's three things he requires from me. I have to pass him the paint because it's a special paint that I had made. Now, if I didn't pass him that, and we'll talk about this later, he could have something defaulted or he gets that. And he only requires two. Give me the car and the money and I'll take care of all of it. Now, in his shop, English is not used. Nobody speaks English in the shop. They're more comfortable speaking Spanish. And I don't have to know Spanish. I interact with him through this little interface. I give him my car. I give him the paint. I give him the money. Now, is he going to call those things the exact same thing in his shop? No. So if we look at that line, kind of like the doorway to the shop, everything outside is an argument. Once it gets inside, once that passes that threshold, well, let's call it a parameter then. So it's the same thing, but it's a little bit different. So the parameters are what they're dealing with. He's dealing with dinero, caro. I'm giving him money and a car. And they may have the exact same value, but they can be called something different. Okay? And We'll deal with that here in a little bit. But conceptually, that's what's going to be taking place as we move forward. I'm going to call the function, and in that call will be the argument. Now, when that function was declared and defined, we saw in the parentheses there, we saw parameters. They don't have to have the same name. It's all about the position. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay? So let's define a function called echo. And we're going to pass it anything. What's anything? It's whatever you want it to be. It may not have a data type associated with it. Well, return anything plus a string plus anything. Echo Rumpelstiltskin. And then it returns that. Now what if I said, you know what, I want to do this again, and I want to pass it the number 2. What happens? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I got to run this first. I hadn't executed it to where it knew what it was. Now it's been defined, and it says, wait a minute. What do we got going on here? Echo is going to concatenate some things. It's going to concatenate a number. No, it's not. You can't concatenate a number. So we need to know the form that it's going to be in. And when we look at what it's doing, we know that it's a string. So in that case, I can put it in quotation marks. It'll run fine. Or I could oh, I didn't want to do it in here. I'll deal with typecasting again later. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but we got to know the form that it's going to be in when we get it, or when we pass whatever it is to them. And the analogy I used previously about money, does it matter if it's Canadian money? Does it matter if it's euros? Well, they were clear. They said, we want this many dollars, and US dollars, not Canadian dollars. So that matters. So in that previous example, we called that function, and we passed it some argument. What did we pass it? The argument was Rumpelstiltskin. What is the parameter? Color. So I passed the argument of Rumpelstiltskin, and it dropped it into this parameter here. And then inside his paint and body shop, he calls it whatever he wants to call it, does whatever he wants to with it. Now, this parameter is kind of like a variable that exists in here. You know, if one of Juan's workers said something about dinero, I don't know what you're talking about. That only exists within the shop. So the parameters exist within the shop. They're local. If we call that function and pass it, what are we passing it? An argument, blue. Blue gets dropped into the parameter color is converted to the parameter color. Let's see if it says what blue is here. It doesn't say it's an argument, but it does say that it's a parameter up here. Passes that argument, drops into that parameter, and then the function does its work. Sets up conditional statement, nested ifs, using the elif. Instead of having to get it really ugly with nested, we just use elif, which is similar to a case or switch statement in other languages. Okay. Now, are we limited to just one thing being passed? Well, if he wanted money, the car, and the paint from me, and I showed up with money, the car, paint, and a truckload of pumpkins, what happens? You know what happens? He's gonna, what the heck's up with these pumpkins? What do I need these pumpkins for? I don't need these. Yeah, no. So I can't pass more arguments, and the arguments that I'm passing have to match up sequentially with the parameters when it was defined. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So this should be straightforward. We pass it, that argument drops into the parameter. The function then takes that parameter inside, does what it needs to, runs the conditional statement, and returns something based on whatever the condition was. Now, we'll talk more about return in a little bit, but in this one, we can only have one return that gets implemented. Traditionally, we'll have the return down at the bottom, and when everything's done running, then it returns. In this case, as soon as we're done with this condition, or this condition is true, we execute that return, and this function's done. Return's the last thing that's taken place, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at the end of the code. And it can be in multiple places depending on how it's written. So remember, we had that do nothing. Do nothing had what in it? Just pass. And when we ran it, did do nothing return anything? No. So when we said go print whatever do nothing gives you, do nothing gave me nothing. Is none or nothing, is that beneficial? Yeah. We can use that none keyword. So it holds a place, and it's in a way saying, hey, there's nothing there. It's not like saying true or false. Those have value. Nothing is, it's empty. There's nothing in there. Okay. Sometimes in Python, when you want to display what's in some object, an instance of a class, if there is nothing in there, it'll just tell you what data type it is. In other instances, like we're seeing here, you executed a function, it says, hey, what's there? None. Didn't tell us what data type it is. If we mouse over it, it's not telling us anything about that. It's a function. It is an object, but it's a special kind of object. So none is useful. And if thing is equivalent to none, then do this. I would say thing equal to none. Let's see. If I said equivalent. So we'll say thing is being assigned a value. It's an assignment operator. Boom. So thing has a value of none. Right? There's nothing there. Nothing there. It's defined. So I can define this variable, gave it a name, I got a place to put things, called thing. What'd you put in it? I didn't put anything in there. But I reserve that space. It's there when I need it. If thing, it's something. Else, it's no thing. Is there anything in there? No. Nothing there. So it's different than a Boolean. It's different than a true or false. Because if I said if thing is none, that's true or false. This is saying if none. There's nothing. So there's no true condition there. There's no condition that's being met. All right. So we'll define a function. We can say, what is thing? If thing is none, then thing is none. Else, thing is true. Else, thing is false. So all we did there was define it and declare it and set up what's going to take place in there. I ran it, nothing happened. Because this is like that paint and body shop. It's not until somebody calls them they're actually doing work in there. Now, here we are. I'm going to call it and pass it none. I'm going to call it, pass it true. Call it, pass it false. And there we go. Thing is none. It's a comparison. Thing is none. It is. This condition is true. Boom. Now, if I came up here and I ran it, thing equals 2. If thing is none, it's nothing. Else, it's something. Oh, it's something now. I put something in it. And when we run it here, it's still good, but I like to rerun these things. What is none? None is none. Thing is true. None is none. True is true. False is false. So if thing is none, in that instance, it's still looking up here where it was none. Come on. This one should not have went logically. I'm misreading it. So we'll stick with the way they've got it. We'll say it's none. It runs. If I want to undo something I've done in my code block, I just say Put focus in that block and hit Control Z. So what is 0? It's false. And it's just checking to see what these things are. Now, let's jump ahead. I'm going to talk about positional arguments. Remember I said he needed 3 things from me: car, paint, and money. And if he says I need those things in a certain order, I need the money first, and then I need the car, and then I need the paint. Or I need the car first, then I need the money, and then I need the paint. How I pass the arguments. So here we're doing a call. I'll go ahead and execute this. Here I'm doing a call on passing 3 arguments. I'm giving it beef, bagel, and Bordeaux. The function receives wine, entree, and dessert. So it's calling them 3 totally different things than I'm passing it. No worries. I could be passing it a variable. At this point, we're passing string literals. So we pass these 3 strings. Each one of these 3 strings is then associated with, it's a variable in here, it's a parameter. Wine exists in the function. So wine comes in. Wine is the first position. Entree is the second position. Dessert is the third position. So whatever's passed in that first position gets dropped into wine. It becomes the wine parameter. The second one is the entree parameter. The third is the dessert parameter. And it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal because they're all the same data type. But it's not about the data type necessarily. It's about what we're doing with it. Okay? If you go drop beef in the wine, well, beef's not a wine. Even though it may be the same data type, it's not the same kind of information. So the order matters. The form of what it's in, data type, matters. It could be a string, a float, and an integer. That matters. Okay. We passed 3 arguments. Those arguments came into 3 distinctly different parameters to be used within the function. Okay. Now, in the example above, we used keyword arguments. And the keyword arguments received whatever we passed it. Let me back up. So here, I said they came in a certain order to align with the parameters order. Keyword, rather than them being in the specific order, we knew what the parameter was called, and we told it, hey, I'm going to pass you these things. I know what you call them, and I don't know what order you need them in, but I know what you call them. So I'm going to go ahead and pass them to you, and when you receive them, you're going to say, oh, this one's the beef, this one's the entree, this one's the dessert, this one's the wine. And the function doesn't have a problem with that, because this is explicitly saying, I'm giving you beef to go in your entree parameter. I'm giving you bagel to go in your dessert parameter. And the example before, we were implicit. It goes in the same position. And that matters. Okay? And if it goes in the same position, then it falls right into where it's being used. So we drop, if we're going the same order, argument goes into parameter. Argument goes into parameter. We don't have to say what parameter beef is, but we can use keyword arguments and be explicit about it. Okay. Can we do a combination of them? Yeah, we can. Now, do they need to be in the right order? Well, that's where it gets kind of funny. If you're not explicit about it, which Frontenac is not explicit, it's not a keyword being defined here. So we're not saying, hey, Frontenac's going to this parameter. It then needs to be in the first position. It'll get dropped in the first position unless you tell it otherwise. The other two, we were explicit. We told them, and they don't have to be in any certain order. So it went, we think about the order, wine, entree, dessert. Wine, dessert, entree. Now, one of the things I can do is define default parameters. Let's say you didn't give me a value for something. You only passed me 2 arguments. I needed 3. Well, okay. Here's a default. Here's the function being defined, menu. Wine, entree, and dessert. Well, if you don't give me a dessert, I'll go ahead and the default's going to be pudding. And default means what it is if you're not explicit and tell me what it needs to be. So if I don't pass them dessert, they're going to tell me what the dessert is. If you don't tell me you want something other than pudding, you're getting pudding. If I have that last one set with a default value, I don't have to pass it. Now, there's a little bit of a hurdle or stumbling block when it comes to doing this. Okay. And the hurdle or the stumbling block that we're going to potentially run into is these functions, they have parameters and they're read in left to right. Wine, entree, dessert. And we look back here, these two were passed explicitly. This one wasn't. Now, the order mattered. If I had the other way around, that could have been an issue. Because if Frontenac was here, is that going to work? Well, let's go look and see what would happen if we did that. Let's take that line of code. And we'll drop it here. But instead of having it in the other order, what happens here? Positional argument cannot appear after keyword arguments. Man. So if we're going to say, hey, here's what it is I'm passing you, that starts on the right. So if when we look at this one, if there's no, if we're not passing in a keyword, we can be implicit like we had been. Just drop it in that parameter. If one of them doesn't have the keyword, it's going to have to be on the left. Because I've got one here that doesn't have the keyword, and it's saying, wait a minute, you can't do that. So that won't work if we tried to do that. Now that's from, what do we call these on this end? This is the call. So what are these in the parentheses of the call? These are arguments. Here's an argument, Frontenac. Here's an argument, dessert equals flan. An argument, entree equals fish. When we come down here, what do we have? Parameters. Parameters wine, parameters entree, parameters dessert. Just like we did over here, we said, hey, if you're going to use keyword, they need to be from right to left. If you're going to have default parameters, they need to be from right to left. It won't let me say wine equals red or wine equals Frontenac and then nothing here. And I'll go show you. See? Same thing. It says, look, if you did it on the left, you need to keep doing it from left to right. If you don't have a default, have the ones that don't have defaults on the left, the ones that do on the right. You can't stop and start, stop and start. Doesn't mean they all have to have defaults, but the ones that have defaults are on the right side. The ones that don't are on the left. Pass it 2 values. No worries. Told you what you're having for dessert. Pass it 3 values. No worries. This is important because we can call the same function, and I don't have to, if I had default values set for all of them, I don't have to pass it anything. And essentially that's like walking into a restaurant, says, yeah, bring me lunch. And they bring you whatever they decide to bring you, what the defaults are, or what the special is. Or I could say, you know what, here's what I want to eat, and I'm very explicit about what I want to eat. And I want to have this for dessert, and I want to have this for my entree, and I want to have this for wine. The names matter. If I'm explicit, the order doesn't matter. If I'm implicit, the order does matter. Okay. Okay, now there's a keyword called, it's an argument, we'll call it arg, A-R-G. See it here. And essentially what this means is, what you pass me is going to go into arg. And I'm going to do whatever with it. And argument came in, and that arg, and it's not, when I say keyword, I'll just say that's a parameter. Okay. Arg's a parameter, comes in, and we're going to call whatever somebody passed us in this function, we're going to call it arg in here. And there's a second parameter. And this parameter has a default value. So this parameter is called result, and it has a default value of nothing. empty list. So when we get into this function, result.append, we took that list that was empty called result, and we gave it, or added onto it, whatever arg. And then it returned the result. So we run this. I called Buggy. Buggy passed it the character A. That argument came in and got appended to that list, and it returned it right here. And then we called the function again. And this time, it should give us a B, drop a B in there. But for some reason, that A is still there. Now, what ends up happening, what's taking place here, I should say, is that by putting this up here, it's persisting in memory. We've got an option. We can put the list inside the function, and when it's inside the function, it's not persistent after the function's been called. One's persistent, the other's not. Even though it's a parameter for that function, it's persistent memory. Here's result, persistent memory. If result is none, we'll go ahead and declare something. We'll make it a list. So if it's nothing, make it a list. And we go through it. And we said, look, tell me, or add argument onto result and then print result. And then we come down here, we printed result, just A. Or was it? So this is a little confusing because this is printing what's being returned, and is something being returned? When I look at it, I don't see the word return. And remember I said this persists. This does not. It's going to make sense now. Here's the call. Print. We call print. We then had the print function call non-buggy. Non-buggy ran and was passed the argument A. That argument came in. Results none. This is persistent. This is not. So this exists, but it's not persistent. Result.append. Add A on the result list. Print result. Boom, there you go. And then this right here is this one. oh no, excuse me, this right here is this A. This print here is what's being returned, and the only thing being returned is that persistent value here. None. None. There's nothing being returned, but it's doing work. We can explode or gather positional arguments with the asterisk. Now, in other languages, we call it a pointer. Right. Python doesn't have pointers, but we can use this asterisk in kind of the same way. I want to print whatever's being returned by excuse me, they got me with the name of this. I'm going to invoke this function or call this function. I'm not passing anything. It doesn't require anything from me per se, and it gets down in here and it says, all right, positional tuple args. And what are the arguments? Just empty parentheses. There's nothing. Positional tuple is the string. What arguments got passed? Nothing. Nothing. We're pointing to whatever's there in those parentheses. It's not something we're going to use so much in this class. It's deeper than what I want to go into in this, but if you're going on to another language, it'll be something you've been exposed to. I'm going to go ahead and stop this one here, and we'll pick up in the next one. That'll be 8-3.